Unit 10, Lecture 3B. I was just talking about the War Powers Act, which is going to reverse the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and put checks back in place on the president, okay? So if he doesn't bring troops home, or if he doesn't have a declaration of war, Congress can bring troops home within 60 days, a reversal of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. I've put up some pictures, very iconic pictures having to do with the Vietnam era. This is Kent State. We'll talk about it in class a little bit. These are victims of a napalm bombing, okay? And this is a Buddhist monk who's protesting American involvement in Vietnam and the Catholic leadership that we're supporting. Okay, so in 1965, President Johnson is going to greatly escalate or increase American involvement, American military buildup in Vietnam. All right, we're going to take our troop numbers from about 20,000 to almost 200,000 at the end of the year. The scale of combat in Vietnam grew larger over the course of the 60s, and by 1968, there's over 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam, about 550,000, all right, 550,000. All right, so although American military forces repeatedly and consistently defeat the North Vietnamese in the field, we can't force an end to the war on favorable terms by fighting a limited war. In Vietnam, we can't tell our enemy from our friend, okay? And they're fighting for their freedom, okay? So it's very hard for us to bring an end to this limited war. The term limited war referred to the American government's decision to avoid military action which might widen the war to include the Soviet Union or Communist China on North Vietnam's side. All right, so we're following a policy of containment in South Vietnam. It also wants to avoid a nuclear conflict or a third world war. All right? So by 1968, the American people became bitterly divided on the issue of American involvement in Vietnam. While many Americans supported the American military and the Johnson's administration's conduct of the war, many other Americans opposed the war. Active opposition to American involvement in Vietnam mounted or increased, especially on college campuses. So if you can give me a little extra credit, you can tell me which college campus that is, if I haven't already told you, okay? After President Johnson declined to seek re-election, the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, won the 1968 presidential election. Johnson's going to quit. He's not going to run for re-election because his popularity has decreased so much because of our involvement in Vietnam, all right? Nixon's going to be elected on a pledge to bring Vietnam to an honorable end, okay? He institutes or starts a policy of Vietnamization, one of your study guide terms. Vietnamization was the Nixon administration's policy of building up South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops. So under Vietnamization, President Nixon withdrew American troops and replaced them with South Vietnamese forces while simultaneously maintaining American military aid to the South Vietnamese government. All right. Ultimately, Vietnamization is going to fail. All right. South Vietnamese troops are going to prove unable to resist invasion by the Soviet-supplied North Vietnamese army. In addition, the Watergate scandal, which we'll talk about in class, was the public forces Nixon to resign as president, okay, from office in '74. And the Watergate scandal, like I said, we'll talk about more. It's the Nixon administration's cover-up of their burglary in the Watergate Hotel into the Democratic National Headquarters, okay? So Nixon's going to resign in '74. Ford will take over in 1975, and while he is serving as president, both North and South Vietnam are merged under communist control, and we'll do a little bit more of this in class. So unlike veterans of World War II who return home to a grateful and supportive nation, Vietnam veterans are going to return to face indifference and sometimes outright hostility from some Americans who had opposed the war, okay? So it's not until several years after the end of the war that the wounds begin to heal, and Vietnam veterans are recognized and honored for their sacrifices and services. Okay, so while the Vietnam War rages in Southeast Asia, the Nixon administration is going to add a new wrinkle to the containment policy. By 1972, President Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, recognized that instead of being strong allies, the communist nations of China and Soviet Union had become rivals for territory and diplomatic influence inside of the communist world. All right, so in the 1970s, Nixon tried to take advantage of this split in the communist countries by negotiating with each side. So in 1972, President Nixon began to establish formal diplomatic relations with Communist China, and he met with Mao in the Chinese capital of Beijing. All right, later that same year, he traveled to Moscow to meet with Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, and they signed the SALT Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This leads to agree to a limit on the production of nuclear weapons. Okay.